morning, friends. I got off social media, which was awesome, and I'm excited to be sharing more on this more long format channel of YouTube. Since I'm a long-winded person, you'll see I'm a bit of a stream of consciousness thinker. My brain likes to crystallize and synthesize information that I've read and see how different frameworks and structures overlap. I know that a lot of what I'll be sharing here as I discuss my inquiry into how we can heal the gender divide may seem very conceptual, but I think that, concepts can be distractions. Like anything can have a light and shadow aspect. Approaching life through the lens of a conceptual framework obviously has its limitations, but the reason that frameworks are useful is because they give us a map. We know that the map is not the territory, but they give us a map of where to place our attention. That's the utility of a map. The utility of a framework is that they give us a place to orient ourselves in an understanding structurally of what may be going on in terms of how certain energies relate to each other, right? So this may seem kind of abstract, but you'll see soon here as I share the research that I've come across, the research that I find the most compelling for answering this question of how to heal the gender divide will be coming from a few different areas and places, notably Polarity Thinking Framework by Barry Johnson. It's going to be interesting to try to convey these frameworks in this format where I'm just talking to you, because each of these frameworks is a visual map, usually a grid or something with 4 quadrants. So there's the Polarity Thinking Framework. There's Relational Life Therapy by Terrence Real, has really made a big impression on me. There's Dr. DeMartini's frameworks for understanding different navigation systems from a lot of our emotional responses and the drama in our lives coming more from our amygdala, and then obviously the healthier, more integrated ways of approaching life coming from the prefrontal cortex. I'm going to start to show how I see that all of these kind of weave together and interface. And the reason that a map or a framework is useful is because it provides a structure. And in addition to those 3 frameworks, I also want to mention that family constellation therapy, which I'm fairly new to, also approaches problems from a more ontological, phenomenological point of view. In other words, a structural point of view. So the reason these maps, again, are useful is because they provide a structure for us to understand how energy can flow coherently and incoherently, right? When these structures and these laws and orders are not abided by, and these are not moral laws, these are structural laws, why and how our families become dysfunctional. So how can I describe this in a way that makes sense? I guess what I'm saying is that there are certain ways of being, certain ways of relating, certain inherent structures of organization at different levels of scale within families, within societies, that are more coherent or less coherent, right? And so you could say that a more coherent family system as it is organized, actually through hierarchy. I'm very interested in what healthy hierarchy is, what characterizes healthy hierarchy. These structures of organization, they're not structures of value, right? A hierarchical structure is an organization in scale on a family level of different roles and responsibilities that allow energy in the system to flow coherently. A hierarchical system is not a moral or a value-based structure, although in its distorted form, it abuses the structure as a means to impose a value discrepancy. But on a purely simplistic phenomenological level, there is structure. We say that there's structure in nature, coherent structure that allows systems to regenerate. And even down onto the level, on a cellular level, the water in our cells, when it is structured, provides electricity. It acts as a battery in our body, whereas when we drink water or basically contribute to conditions in our lives that destructure that water, there's a loss of coherence, there's a loss of intelligence, there's a loss of flow of energy and nutrition and sustenance to a system. So I'm very interested in these maps and these models as frameworks for understanding what is a structurally coherent way to live as a family system, as a male and a female, in a society that is patriarchal, in a society that is based on a structure that is actually incoherent. How do you, I mean, it's obviously coherent enough to that it's sustained itself this far, right? So it's kind of like I've heard it said, the main part of the word dysfunction is function, right? Dysfunction works just functionally enough to work, but not functionally enough to really sustain itself in a way that's fulfilling for people. And often if it's dysfunctional enough, eventually it will collapse, right? So I think right now we're seeing a lot of the collapse of many families. Men and women are just kind of at a reset point where there's just certain things that just don't work anymore. And so we really need to sink deeper into a level of understanding of coherency that will allow us to function so that we can raise children who have a sense of purpose, raise children who have a sense of the potential, the creative potential of the masculine and feminine coming together and working together. And patriarchy doesn't provide that model. Now, when I say patriarchy, language is difficult and there are many nuances and how we need to be very clear when we use language about what we mean about that. And one thing you should know about me in the way that I approach an attempt at understanding like a lot of complexity is that I see that in this dimension as humans, and just in the universe, every energy and every essence has both a healthy, exalted aspect and a shadow aspect. And this contrast of the light and the shadow define each other. They can't exist without each other. It's not that one is bad and one is good. It's just that everything has light and shadow. So in the same way, patriarchy and patriarchal systems, like patriarchy is simply the description of a society led primarily by men in the masculine principle. And that could have a very healthy manifestation or a very unhealthy manifestation. So currently we're mostly experiencing the more distorted shadow aspect of patriarchy. When we say patriarchy, most people see that as a negative thing, as excessive control, an extractive-based economy. Certainly capitalism and this shadow toxic patriarchy work hand in hand. Capitalism relies on and depends on imbalances of power and abuses of power to extract resources, and I'll go into a bit of the history that I've learned about that, about how instrumental patriarchy was in implementing capitalism. But nevertheless, this is all just a way of pointing out, before I launch into that when I use the word patriarchy, I don't mean that male leadership is by definition a negative thing, or that what male leadership is an abuse of power. You could even argue that the current form of imbalanced power between men and women, which I believe arises from a real structural difference, not imbalance, but difference, that this current form of patriarchy that we're experiencing could actually be argued can only exist because of the absence of healthy patriarchy. In other words, the absence of healthy male leadership to protect families and to support and cherish the divine feminine. The absence of that is what has allowed this distorted form of patriarchy, which is what we usually call patriarchy, right? So I just want to make that distinction, because I think that we do need patriarchy more than ever. We don't necessarily need patriarchy in the sense, in my opinion, of a society ruled or led primarily by men. But on the other hand, to the extent that women become vulnerable when they have children and they become dependent on men inherently as a structural reality, to some extent, yes, I've heard this said that masculinity is the greatest untapped resource that we have. To some extent, yes, we do need a culture that is led by men. If women didn't have babies, then if families didn't exist, there would be no need for any kind of hierarchy like that, but we do. When women have a child, they are functionally and structurally vulnerable and dependent, and dependency is what creates a power imbalance. So the vulnerability and the lower position, and by lower I don't mean lower in value, although that's the way toxic patriarchy interprets it or utilizes it, What I mean is structurally lower in the chain of organization. A woman is going to be at a structurally lower, in other words, more dependent position, in the same way that the child is structurally lower and more dependent on the mother, and the father is the outer ring, the outer holding field, right? So we need men of great integrity to hold that field, to hold the family. And if our society is any reflection of how well many men are doing that, our families are fragmented, our communities are fragmented. So we desperately need men to take leadership roles in places and of compassion. And there's actually a framework from Omru Pani, who's a BDSM coach, whose work I like, because he's a nerd when it comes to power dynamics. And you can learn a lot from people who have been playing around with power dynamics sexually. You can learn a lot about sexual politics and what it means to show up in integrity with the built-in power imbalances that exist structurally by listening to what the people in the BDSM community have to say about it. And what he says, and I'm going to end with this and wrap it up, is that essentially the regenerative ability of all systems to continue in a healthy way, essentially like the foundation of all healthy relationships is consistent mutual reciprocity. And this toxic patriarchy is not based in reciprocity, it's based in over-extraction. So what he says is that the thing that makes a healthy patriarchy healthy, or he didn't use the word patriarchy, but the thing that makes a hierarchy healthy versus unhealthy, since everything will have a healthy and shadow aspect, is when the energy flows in both directions. So in a hierarchy, those who are lower down are supposed to respect and look up to those who are higher up. But as he points out, that can only happen by way of the level of cherishing that those who are higher up provide to those who are lower down. And that would not just be flowing from men to women, but also to mothers and to their children, right? So what he's pointing out is that respect is not something that flows down, at least not in the way he's using the term. Like, I think everyone wants mutual respect, and you could say that cherishing is a form of respect, but what he's saying is respect is something that happens when you look up to someone because they have qualities of an integrity, right? So respect isn't something that you do just as an obligation. Respect is something that is naturally generated and automatically generated as a result of actions of integrity. And the level of integrity required of anyone, male or female, who's in a position of power structurally because someone else is dependent on them, is cherishing. That there needs to be an energy of cherishing the vulnerability and the dependency of those who are dependent on them. And that cherishing of that vulnerability, understanding the sacredness of it, is what automatically generates respect by those who are lower down, right? So I think this is fascinating because what it means is it's a model that automates a regenerative system of mutual reciprocity based in cherishing and respect. And the respect is not something that those who are lower down give just automatically without that cherishing, but it is something that arises automatically with cherishing, right? So cherishing is critical if we want to have healthy relationships, and appreciation and really understanding the sacred sacrifice that occurs when a woman chooses to have a child and becomes vulnerable in that way, and how necessary it is to cherish that so that she can then have the resources and energy to properly cherish her own child. This seems like intuitive, like something that is so obvious that it needs to happen, that it is rather remarkable that it doesn't. So I can talk more about that in another video, but I think that maybe explains a bit of what I want to explore here, and stay tuned for future videos on this topic.